My name is Abby Kratz. I'm very happy to be able to be here to welcome you on behalf of the Ackerman Center for Holocaust Studies to UT Dallas and to the Spring 2013 Einsbruck Lecture Series. I want to extend special welcome to Mr. Edward Ackerman and Dr. Burton Einsbruck, who we are fortunate enough to have both of them here today. Welcome. And thank you for joining me in recognizing them for their inspiring support to the Holocaust Studies program at the university. We're very grateful. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Timothy Snyder, an eminent scholar, a masterful author, who has been described in the New Republic as a man of extraordinary learning, whose vivid imagination leads him to see combinations, similarities, and general trends where others would see only chaos and confusion. I know we're all looking forward to hearing Dr. Snyder's comments tonight. In order to make it possible to hear Dr. Snyder's remarks without interruption, please let me remind you to silence your cell phones and other electronic devices. And let me also ask that you look at your programs, find the white card that says Friends on it, and please fill this out so that we can get in touch with you in the future and keep you informed about what we're doing at the Holocaust Center and have you on our mailing list. Please leave that card with us today and then plan to return tomorrow at 9 to hear Dr. Snyder's second lecture that will be called How Could the Holocaust Have Happened? Before we proceed any further, though, I must thank my predecessor, Dr. Debbie Pfister, and center staff members Marshall Coleman and Cindy Rogers for all the work they've done to make this evening and these events possible. At this point, Dr. Hobson Wildenthal, our provost, had planned to join me in welcoming you to the university, but he has been called away unexpectedly and can't be with us for this part of the program tonight. So Dr. Dennis Kratz, who's Dean of the School of Arts and Humanities, and that's the academic home of the center and the Holocaust Studies faculty as well, he will now extend the greetings that Dr. Wildenthal would have extended to you. Dr. Kratz.
Thank you, Dr. Kratz, the better. Good afternoon. It is my distinct honor, speaking on behalf of President David Daniel and Provost Wildenthal, to welcome you to the University of Texas at Dallas this afternoon and the Einsbruck Lecture sponsored by the Ackerman Center for Holocaust Studies. Oliver Wendell Holmes once wrote that, quote, "A word is not a crystal, transparent and unchanged. It is the skin of a living thought and may vary greatly in color and content according to the circumstances and time in which it is used." Let's pause for a moment before the lecture to think of the university where you are now in light of this metaphor. In the current time and circumstances, the conversation about the value of the university and higher education in general tends to focus on our role and importance as an economic engine, a place for students seeking marketable skills that can hopefully be translated into gainful employment and rewarding careers. Our primary function viewed from this perspective is to create a reservoir of expertise and innovation to strengthen the economy and competitive well-being of our city, state, and nation. Like all interpretations of complex ideas, this one is partially correct. Universities, however, also are the skin of another, I think, more fundamental idea. We provide a different kind of purpose, we have a different role, and another kind of abiding value. We create for students a place and faculty to engage in the pursuit of knowledge and understanding that can hopefully be translated into meaningful lives and worthy societies. Our function and our aspiration is to provide a reservoir not only of expertise and imagination, but also of wisdom that can elevate the spirit and invigorate the better nature of all the citizens of our community, city, and state, and nation, and perhaps the world. A university such as UT Dallas, with our expressed commitment to excellence in research, in engineering and the sciences, has a corollary obligation to conduct and disseminate humanistic inquiry that addresses the most profound issues of our time. This afternoon is dedicated to that, I believe, more fundamental role of the university. We have an obligation, I believe, for deep research into the humanities, to look carefully, as Professor Snyder has done, into who we are, what we have been, and what we ought to be. Not only the depths to which human beings can sink, but the heights to which we hope we can ascend. I know of no component of my university that contributes as profoundly to that living, fundamental role of the university as the Ackerman Center for Holocaust Studies. And so it is my honor not only to welcome you, but to introduce to you and call to the podium my friend, the director, the chair of the Board of Advisors of the Holocaust Center, Sally Bolovsky. Sally?
I've never had a harder act to follow, but my name is Selwyn Kratz-Bolovsky. No nepotism at UT Dal. On behalf of the advisory board, I want to welcome everybody also. It's wonderful to see so many old friends and so many new friends here. This could be a glorious afternoon with Dr. Snyder. What wasn't mentioned is that after the lecture today, there's going to be a book signing outside, and you can purchase this book that was published in 2010, and it has shocked the world. It's one of the greatest books of European history and the Holocaust that's come along in a long, long time. So they're going fast, so you might get a copy of it and have it signed afterwards. Did I do that all right? Okay. I once went to a dinner event where they had Terry Bradshaw from the Pittsburgh Steelers make a motivational speech, and he wanted to get an idea of what kind of audience he had. So he said, how many here are lawyers? And half the audience raised their hands. And he said, how many are accountants? And another 30% raised their hand. How many are doctors? Another 20% raised their hand. And he said, how many are professional football players? None. So I want to ask this crowd, how many here are a Holocaust survivor? Raise your hand. 1, 2. How many are children of a Holocaust survivor? 1, 2, 3, 4. How many are descendants of people who came from Poland, Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Hungary, or Romania? That's about everybody here. And I'm included with you. And we come from that group that when we see pictures of the Holocaust, we're able to say, there but for the grace of God. And we were thankful that our ancestors came to this great country and we survived and they survived. But the one thing we all have in common is this belief that the Holocaust should always be remembered, the victims of the Holocaust should always be remembered, and that future generations and this generation need to know what happened, and they need to learn the lessons of the Holocaust, the lessons of tolerance and compassion and rights of all people. And that's what we do here at the University of Texas at Dallas. This is what the Ackerman Center focuses on. We teach students, graduates and undergraduates, the history of the Holocaust, and many of them go on to become teachers of the Holocaust, and they go on to colleges and high schools and teach the future generations. So that's something we do. And the reason we're so successful here, and it is one of the most successful programs in the country, is that we have the support from this administration, from the president to the provost to the dean of the School of Arts and Humanities. It's the most wonderful support that any department could possibly ask for. In addition, we have the Board of Advisors, our advisory board, 32 or 33 volunteers who are dedicated to making this program better in all ways through advice, but also financial support. And then we have 4 terrific professors here, and 3 of them are endowed, and hopefully the 4th one will be endowed soon also. But that endowment comes from the generosity of people, some of them in this audience. We have with us John Massey. I don't know if he can raise his hand, but John endowed the Hill Feinberg, there's John, the Hill Feinberg Chair for Holocaust Studies. We have the Barnetts, Mimi Barnett, Mitch Barnett, who were the first people to endow a chair, and that's the chair that Professor Ashvath has. So we're very blessed to have that, and we have Stan Rabin and Barbara Rabin here, and they endowed the chair for Niels Roma. Niels is here too, in the first row. So very few colleges have that kind of leadership and that kind of support from the community. And at this time, I also want to thank everybody here who supported the annual campaign that we have called the Friends of the Holocaust Studies program. So that, in short, is my way to say thank you all for coming, and thank you all for your support. And we're just delighted that you're here, and that we're looking forward to greater things in the future, and we're going to work real hard to do that. It's my pleasure now to introduce Zsuzsi Ashvath, person who needs no introduction. We wouldn't be here if it wasn't for Zsuzsi Ashvath, because she came to this campus 30 years ago and taught the first courses in Holocaust studies. I don't think she imagined then what it would become now, but you've done it, Zsuzsi. Zsuzsi is... Zsuzsi is herself a survivor of the Holocaust from Budapest and from Hungary, and she recently wrote a best-selling book called When the Danube Ran Red. That was her memoir. It's been well received all over the country. Zsuzsi teaches graduate and undergraduate courses here. She is a world expert on a Hungarian poet named Miklos Radnadi. She translates his poems. He was a young poet who was killed, murdered in a death march in Hungary. And Zsuzsi translates his poems into English. She is on the board of directors of the Dallas Holocaust Museum, and she's also a member of the Texas Holocaust Commission. She was appointed by the governor. So, but the main thing I want to say about Zsuzsi is that from her life experiences, that she's become a person that changes people's lives. I know she changed my life. I know she changes the lives of everyone who she meets and all the students that she teaches. She's available to everyone, whoever calls her to make a speech at a church, at an organization, at the medical school. She's there for them, and she never says no. And she never says no to any of her students or her colleagues that want time with her. She's an extraordinary woman. Ladies and gentlemen, Zsuzsi Ashvath.
Thank you, Sally, very much. It's really difficult to talk after such introduction. One's throat is a little bit too tight. But anyway, I try it. I would like to welcome you to this wonderful occasion to he listened to the lectures, and today's lecture of Professor Timothy Snyder, who is the Bird White Howsam Professor of History at Yale University. Professor Snyder has done major work, as you perhaps know, but in a way how incredibly important that work is, you see when you look into it. So I very much would like to encourage you to look into his work, what he has done in Ukrainian, Estonian, Lithuanian, Polish, Russian research. It is one of the most important research in Holocaust studies because there has been so little and so not 100% satisfying work that has been done. Not only, but much of it had been like that in the past. He has written 5 or 6 major books, has won major awards, and is now here with this book, Bloodlands, that is already translated into 14 languages. I welcome Professor Snyder and want to tell him how happy we are that he is here.
In the early spring of 1933, in Soviet Ukraine, a young man dug his own grave. Why would you dig your own grave? Well, there was a practical reason. By the spring of 1933, in Soviet Ukraine, a couple of million people had already starved to death as a result of a deliberate campaign of hunger organized in the Soviet Union. So people were dying all around him. But I think there was another reason as well. If you died of hunger in Soviet Ukraine in the spring of 1933, your body would be found by the side of the road or in a field. It would be thrown into the carts, the horse-drawn carts that came through the village about once a week. It would be buried along with the bodies of dozens or hundreds of people you didn't know in a place where your family, if anyone from your family survived, would be very unlikely to find you. So I think the other reason this man dug his grave had something to do with human dignity. And when the day came, he found the grave that he had dug. In the spring of 1940, not very long after this, and not very far away, a Polish officer was keeping a diary. There was nothing particularly unusual about this. In the Polish army, most of the officers were reserve officers, and almost all of the reserve officers were university graduates. They'd all been called up in 1939 when Poland was invaded on the one side by the Wehrmacht, the German army, and then 16 days later from the other side by the Soviet Union, by the Red Army. This Polish prisoner of war happened to be a prisoner of the Soviets, of the Red Army. He was held in a prison camp. He kept his diary there. Then he was taken by train and bus to a place that we know as Katyn. He kept his diary right up to the end. The second to last entry of his diary reads, "They asked for my wedding ring, which I, ... It trails off. He doesn't say what he's done with his wedding ring. Why doesn't he say what he's done with his wedding ring? It's not because in his diary he hesitates to write about his wife or his love for his wife or his family. He writes about these things. It was for a very practical reason. This Polish officer suspected, as it turns out correctly, that he was about to be executed by the Soviet secret state police, the NKVD, and he knew that before he would be executed, they would ask him to hand over his valuables. So he'd hidden his wedding ring in the expectation that his executors would read his diary. They surely did read his diary. They probably found his wedding ring anyway. In September of 1942, again, not very long afterwards and not very far away, in a town called Kovel, in what's now western Ukraine, in what before the war had been southeastern Poland, and what now, in September 1942, was under German occupation. In the town of Kovel, which then, as for the previous 500 years or so, was mostly a Jewish town in its population, the remaining Jews were locked inside one of the synagogues. By September of 1942, enough of the Second World War had passed, enough of the events that we call the Holocaust had passed, so that they knew what was about to happen. They knew why they were locked in the synagogue. They knew that rather soon they would be taken out and shot, which is how, of course, the Holocaust happened in that part of the world. So what did they do? They left a trace. They wrote on the walls of the synagogue in Hebrew, Yiddish, Polish, with pens, more often with shards of porcelain or of rocks, with whatever came to hand. One of the people who left a message was a young woman. She was there with her two younger sisters. She left a message for her mother, which includes the words, "I'm so sorry that you're not here with us," which seems at first to be a strange sentiment, doesn't it? She knows she's about to die. Why does she want her mother to be in the same place? It seems strange to us because when we think of the Holocaust, we think of rescue and escape and all of these very unlikely, improbable things. But this is an experience which is much closer to the way people actually pass through the terrible event. People wanted to stay with their families. They wanted to be with their families. It's one of the main reasons why so few people escaped, and it's a reason which is very easy for us to forget. So she writes, "We're so sorry that you can't be with us." And she concludes the note, "We kiss you over and over." The problem with this book, the problem with the history that this book recounts, is that these three are just three of about 14 million stories. These three human beings are among the approximately 14 million human beings, Jews, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Poles, others, who were killed as a matter of policy between 1933 and 1945 in the places that in the book I call the Bloodlands, between Berlin and Moscow. Now, the striking thing about this place that I'm calling the Bloodlands is that you can define it in three different ways. The first of them I've already done. This is the place where 14 million human beings were killed, a very large number. That alone should probably attract our attention. The second way you can define this place is to note that this is where the Holocaust happened. Here, nowhere else. This is where most of the Jews who died in the Holocaust lived, and it is where practically all of the Jews who died in the Holocaust died. The Jews who were not from here were brought here in order to be killed. The third thing we can say about this region is that this is the place where German and Soviet power were both present between 1933 and 1945. There were, of course, many places where German power was present and Soviet power was not present, right? Germany, Scandinavia, the Low Countries, France. And there are many places where Soviet power was present, where German power was never present. Most of the Soviet Union, which of course, would extend all the way out to here. The Germans only ever touched about 5% of the Soviet Union. Most of it was untouched. So there's a huge, massive terrain from the Atlantic to the Pacific, which is touched by either German or Soviet power. And on this huge Eurasian territory, the largest part of the largest continent on Earth, the total number of people killed was about 17 million, which is a terrifying figure. But if one compares that figure, 17 million, with 14 million, one notices something very interesting. The huge majority of the killing carried out by the two regimes is right here, 14 million out of 17 million. Now, this suggests that the region is very important, not only if what we want to do is chronicle the fate of the victims, but also if what we want to do is understand the two regimes. If the regimes are of interest to us because they killed so many people, then the place where they killed so many people must also be interesting to us. Now, everything that I've said so far is just a matter of geography and arithmetic. The basis for all of the things I've said so far are factual matters which have been established beyond any shadow of controversy. The conclusions that I've given you thus far are just a matter of adding things in a certain way and looking at a map in a certain way. Now, admittedly, in the 21st century in the United States, arithmetic and geography are not our strongest subjects. A remark that I make only partially in jest. Nevertheless, if what I'm saying is true, if what I've said thus far is true, if I can convey to you the essence of the worst catastrophe in the history of Europe in 5 minutes by only referring to maps and numbers, why is it that we haven't seen this catastrophe before? Why haven't we understood it in this way? I think the answer is, and it's an important question, right? If this is the greatest catastrophe in the history of Europe, why doesn't it have a history? It's an important question. I think the answer is we have touched upon it, but in different, limited ways. Of course, there are histories of national suffering, of national martyrdom. There are Lithuanian histories of Lithuanians, Ukrainian histories of Ukrainians, Polish histories of Poles, and so on. There are histories of Soviet terror. And of course, there is the body of literature that we are perhaps most familiar with, the history of the Holocaust. It's striking, though, that you can read all three of these bodies of literature. You can read about national suffering, about the Holocaust, about Soviet terror, without it coming clear to you that they're all happening in the same place, right? And once you've noticed that simple fact, that they've all happened in the same place, you then begin the line of questioning which is at the center of this book. What relationship might these events have had to each other? Just to put it in a graphic way, if this is the place, and it is, where the Holocaust happened, that's approximately 6 million Jews. There are 8 million non-Jews who were also killed in the same place where the Jews were killed while Hitler was in power. Is it possible that we can understand the Holocaust without knowing that basic thing? It strikes me that it's not. Which brings me to the second thing I wanted to say. It's not so easy to take these different kinds of history and put them together. History is organized nationally. It's organized by national organizations charged with heritage and memory. It's organized according to historians who work chiefly in one language on one national history. Even the Library of Congress is organized nationally. And there's a politics to this as well. You can't take a book of Polish history and a book of Ukrainian history and push them together and get East European history. You can't take a book of Estonian history and a book of Jewish history and just stack them together and by osmosis get some kind of synthesis. There's a reason for this. In the conventions of national history, different people are the subject, different people are the friends, different people are the enemies. And for the conventions of national history maintained, national histories must not speak to one another. But there's a deeper problem than this, I fear. And that is the problem of politics. Ever since the French Revolution, I realize that no one here has been alive since the French Revolution, but ever since the French Revolution, we have had the tendency in the West to think of politics in terms of left and right, to think of politics as being binomial, to think of there being two possibilities in politics which are opposed to each other. This is a tendency which was strengthened very much by Hitler's rise to power and Stalinism, each of which seemed to be right and left, and by the feeling in the 1930s that one had to choose between one or the other and that the two were the opposites. This leads us, I think, even today, to think about the Nazis and the Soviets, not in terms of arithmetic or geography, but rather in terms of their ideas. And their ideas are important, of course, and I'll return to how they're important. But when we think of them in terms of ideas, we tend to classify them in terms of a kind of mental geometry. So the Nazis are on the right. This is your right, it's my left. I never know quite how to handle this because no matter what I do, it's going to look silly. The Nazis are on the right, the far right. The Soviets are on the far left. Once you have made that move in your own mind, once you have classified the ideas that way, there's no reason for them to come into contact. They're different, they have different ideas, they've been placed differently. And that is, I think, the convention according to which we operate, and the convention which is very comfortable for us, because we in America, we in Texas, we in America, we throughout the West, often identify ourselves in terms of right and left, and when we want to be critical, we're thinking of people who are on the other side, right? This hasn't stopped. So for this reason, it's very difficult for us to imagine that the Soviets and the Nazis actually operated in the same place, that there might be a political geography, namely the political geography of Eastern Europe, which is very different from our own mental geometry. Our mental geometry is convenient for us. It's very hard to break through, in fact, because it's so convenient. What it can't do is explain the experiences of the people who lived in this territory. Because everyone, just to make the point as simply as I can, everyone who lived in this territory, whether they were Jewish or Belarusian or Estonian, whether they were a Gypsy, a Latvian, or a Pole, everyone who lived in this territory, so long as they were alive, which admittedly is an important qualification, but so long as they were alive, experienced both regimes. Their biographies include contact with both regimes. And for that very simple reason, we can't begin to understand their lives and cumulatively their history without some awareness of both of the regimes. So, it's easy to criticize. It's easy to say there are these fundamental things like political geography we should take into account. How might we try to overcome this problem? If it really is the case, and I think it is, that we're used to seeing history in national terms, we're used to classifying history in terms of right and left, how might we try to overcome this? In the book, I try to follow three very simple and conservative, I think, methods. The first of them is that there's no national exceptionalism in this book. Now, that might seem simple or laudable. It's not at all simple, and it's certainly not always lauded. No national exceptionalism means that the book is about everyone who lived on this territory. I don't start with the Jews and then say, oh yes, there were some other people who happened to live there. I don't start with the Ukrainians and mention along the way that there were other people who happened to live there. The book concerns everyone who lives on the territory, regardless of who they were, and it follows their experiences through the 13 years that are its subject. Now, why is this, hopefully that sounds simple. Why is this such a difficult move to make, and why is it so important? It's a difficult move to make because that is just not how history is organized. If I ask you to think about the Holocaust and the things that are associated with it, the way that your mind works, I mean, I don't mean this about any of you personally, but you know, you can just shake your heads if this is not true of you. But the way that your mind works is that you go back and you think the pogroms of 1919, or you think the pogroms of 1881, or you think the Khmelnytsky uprising of the 17th century. You think vertically down into the past about other events in Jewish history which might in some way be like the Holocaust or anticipate the Holocaust. And the same is true of everybody else, I can assure you. When Poles think about Katyn in 1940, they think also about the treatment of Poles during the Bolshevik Revolution. They think about the treatment of Poles during the national uprisings of the 19th century, and so on. When Ukrainians think about the famine of 1933, they think about the oppression of Ukrainian peasants under the Russian Empire and under Polish landlords, all the way back into history, and so on and so on. National history makes sense of great catastrophes by referring to things in the past which in some sense seem to anticipate them, right? The problem with this is that it only makes sense the way that a novel makes sense. It gives us a kind of identity. It makes the past easy for us. It makes the past seem to be heading towards some kind of terrible final end. but it doesn't explain anything. And let me just try to show you very quickly how this doesn't explain anything. You can know everything about Jewish history up to 1938. That will not mean that you anticipate something like the Holocaust. And the very simple way of showing this is to just list the excellent Jewish historians who in 1938 had no sense that such a cataclysm was possible. Or for that matter, who had no sense it was possible even while it was happening. You can know everything about Ukrainian history up to 1932. That's not going to allow you to predict that 3 million Ukrainians are going to be starved in the next year, and so on and so on and so on. So this way of thinking about the past helps us to make sense of it for ourselves as national communities, but what it cannot do, what it absolutely cannot do is explain. It can't explain how these things happen. And the reason, the dark reason, the unpleasant reason why it can't explain is that the causes of these events go beyond the nation. They go beyond our own nation, and they even go beyond the nations that are next to us that we may like or not like. They go beyond national history. The second thing that I try to do, so no exceptionalism was the first thing. The second thing that I try to do is I try to avoid dialectics. Now, unless some of you went to, communist elementary school, which I understand aren't doing so well in Dallas these days, the notion of dialectics might seem a little far off, so let me try to be clear about what I mean. Dialectics are ways of putting arguments together so that uncomfortable realities can be dismissed. So what's a good example of the use of dialectics? Here's an example which one comes across still in Eastern Europe rather often. On the one hand, the Soviet Union killed millions of its own citizens in the 1930s. But on the other hand, the Red Army won the Second World War, didn't it? Now, many people think like that and can admit it. That made a certain amount of sense to you when I first said it. Okay, maybe it did, maybe it didn't. It doesn't make any sense at all. It didn't actually help the Red Army to kill millions of people in the 1930s. Moreover, and here's the basic historian's point, you simply cannot explain an event that happens in 1933, like the starvation of Ukrainians, by referring to an event that happens in 1945, the liberation of Eastern Europe by the Red Army. That's a nice way of telling a story, but it doesn't make any historical sense. I can't explain why you are here in 2013 by referring to things that will happen in 2025, right? I mean, not without some kind of fantastic crystals, which, or some kind of metaphysics, which doesn't really exist. So that's the kind of reasoning that one has to avoid, that one thing cancels out another thing. Another example of this is the way that many of us here in the West, I think about the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. A way that is very convenient because it solves a problem and it makes complexity seem simple. I think many of us imagine that what happens in the Second World War is the Germans do some very bad things, and then the Soviets come and somehow cancel those things out, and then we can just start from zero. Now, that would be very simple if it were true. But the basic problem with this notion, is that 1 + 1 doesn't equal 0. One of the fundamental and really basic, you see I'm calling this conservative because it's also simple. One of the basic points of this book is that 1 + 1 is 2. The accumulation of German and Soviet occupation is worse than just having one, right? The two of them, when combined, don't cancel each other out, like magnetically or magically. The two of them combined exacerbate each other. They don't only accumulate, they provoke. They lead to outcomes which one of them alone could never have led to. The third thing that I try to do, and this is, I hope, again, going to seem straightforward when I say it, is that I don't believe that any events should be allowed to escape from history. Now, this is especially important in a discussion about the Holocaust, because the Holocaust is often regarded as something which is chiefly to do with commemoration or with memory or with politics. It has to do with all of those things. But for it to have anything to do with all of those things in the long run, it must be understood as a historical event. And when we pull it out of its historical setting and say, for example, you can't talk about anything else while you're talking about the Holocaust, the end result of that is that you can't talk about the Holocaust either. If you pull anything out of its historical setting, it will eventually cease to exist. That's the moral reason why I think the Holocaust has to be understood as a historical event. Of course, there's a very practical reason as well. The only way for me to understand the Holocaust is to treat its sources like I treat other sources, to subject those sources to the same kind of analysis I would subject other sources to. And there's one particular point I want to make here. When I say that I'm keeping everything in history, what do I mean by everything? What's the subject of this book? This is something which I want to be clear about. The subject of this book are deliberate killing policies. That is, policies that are designed to take the lives of very large numbers of human beings. That may seem very simple, but it's important to be clear about this. These two regimes, the Nazi regime and the Soviet regime, had policies that were meant to kill people. Those policies usually involved starvation. The next means that was used after starvation was shooting. The third most important was gas. These means were used to kill people. Notice that I'm not mentioning the camps. The camps were terrible institutions in both the German and the Soviet empires. They killed a couple of million people during the period we're talking about, which is a very large number and not at all to be neglected. But the camps were not where the killing policies took place. People who were selected for a camp were not being selected for a gas chamber. In Stalin's Soviet Union, people who were sent to the Gulag were people who were not being shot in a garage or in a forest outside of the city where they lived. So the camps are a horrible part of the story, but unfortunately the camps are an introduction. They're not the story itself. The huge majority of victims of the Holocaust, for example, never saw a camp. So it's important to keep in mind that when we think of the camps, we're not thinking of the Holocaust. We're not thinking of the killing policies. We're thinking of policies of punishment and exhaustion, which led to a tremendous number of deaths. But we're not the worst policies of these regimes. It's only the beginning. Okay. So, I've tried to stress how important I think territory is. And territory is important because, among other reasons, it allows us to read the sources and in some way to hear the voices of everyone who was there, whatever language they might have left these sources in, which is a very important thing. But what does territory mean for us intellectually? If it's all well and if it's true, as I'm saying, that we have to see this territory, understand this territory, grasp this territory, how do we explain anything with territory? If the numbers are here, if the Holocaust is here, that's fine. But then how do we explain it? How do we account for it? If we pay all this attention to territory, does this mean that we don't care about ideas? No, on the contrary. To pay attention to territory is to take ideas seriously. It's very easy to say, as we want to say in this country, that the Holocaust happened because of an anti-Semitic idea, or the famine or the terror in the Soviet Union happened because of Leninism or Marxism. There are so many steps in that argument that have to be made, right? I mean, Hitler in 1924 articulates a preposterous worldview in Mein Kampf. To get from there to the actual murder of 5.4 million Jews as a matter of German policy requires so much. Think of all the other people in 1924 who also had preposterous worldviews, who also wished for the extermination or elimination of other groups, and whose wishes were not fulfilled, right? To get from the idea to the deed requires an awful lot of argumentation. And the same is true of Marxism, right? I mean, contrary to what one hears on talk radio, it's just not the case that Marxism walks down the street and murders people. In Vienna in the 1920s, Marxism was the governing ideology. The city was ruled by Marxists. And the worst thing that happened was public swimming pools, or public kindergartens, or public housing. Those are the worst things that happened. So I'm making a very basic point here about ideas. The very first thing we have to do, and this is something that historians have done a very good job at, in my opinion, is to show how ideas come to animate institutions. In the case of anti-Semitism, the fundamental point is there has to be an anti-Semitic state, Nazi Germany, which destroys its neighboring states. Both of those parts are very important for what happens. In the case of the Soviet Union, Marxism has to become Leninism, which has to become the governing ideology of the Soviet Union. Now, the second thing that we have to be able to do with ideology, and this is a little bit trickier, is we have to understand how ideology deals with time. So here we are in the 21st century. I'm asking you to think about the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s. That's already hard enough. I'm asking you to think about the ideas of that period. And now I'm asking you to think about how those ideas considered time, how they look towards the future and the past. Let me try to convince you how important this is. In the case of the Soviet Union, and this is ironic because remember the Soviet Union is Marxist, it's revolutionary, it should be thinking about a glorious future. In the case of the Soviet Union in the 1930s, the most important ideas, the most important commitments had to do with the past. What Stalin thought he was doing in the 1930s and 1940s was defending a revolution of 1917, defending the Bolshevik Revolution, which had created the Soviet Union. So from the point of view of Stalin, the revolution is in the past. From the point of view of Hitler, and now again this is ironic, right? Because we're used to thinking of the Nazis as being on the right, of having something to do with the right. For Hitler, the most important revolution was in the future. From the point of view of Hitler, or Heydrich, or Göring, or Goebbels, or any of these people, Himmler, the revolution could only take place when Germans had conquered for themselves a huge empire in Eastern Europe. This would allow Germans to revitalize themselves racially and so on. So from 1933, when Hitler comes to power, until 1941, the revolution hasn't happened yet. For most of the time that Hitler is in power, the Nazis are looking forward, and I mean that both in the way we use the phrase, looking forward, anticipating with pleasure, but also in the sense of time. They're looking forward to a revolution which hasn't happened yet. Now, why is this so important? Because it shows us a very important difference between the two regimes. The Soviets killed almost entirely when they were not at war, and they killed almost entirely on their own territory. The Nazis killed almost entirely when they were at war, and they killed almost entirely beyond their own territory. Now, that's a difference between the two systems, but from the point of view of the people that we're talking about, we have to remember that this is maybe a distinction without so much of a difference. Because beyond Nazi Germany is in large measure the same thing as inside the Soviet Union. Okay. The third thing we have to be able to do with ideology, if we want to make sense of all this, if we want to take ideas seriously and territory seriously, is we have to see how ideology is related to economics. Okay, why is this so terribly important? In our own ways of thinking about the world, economics passes as something which is not ideological, right? Which is, of course, just about the most foolish part of the American worldview. There is nothing more ideological than economics. The moment that someone claims to you that economics is ideology-free, you just then have to ask exactly what it is that you're being sold at that moment. All economic visions are ideological. This is one of the things which Marx certainly had right. So if we want to take seriously Nazi ideology, if we want to ask how Nazi ideology was so destructively effective, we have to know what its economics were. Here's what they were. The idea of Nazi economics was that Germany was already a mature, capitalist, industrial economy, in some ways from Hitler's point of view, too mature, overripe, decadent. And what it needed was a huge colony in the East. This colony in the East would allow Germany to become self-sufficient in food, and therefore allow it to become balanced in its economics, and therefore allow it to become a world power. Soviet ideology is also economic, right? What's the Soviet political economy? It's almost the opposite. The Germans want to take an advanced country and add agricultural terrain to it. The Soviets want to take a territory that they regard as backward and modernize it, industrialize it as quickly as possible. So what the Soviets want to do is they want to take control of their own agricultural hinterland, control the territory, control the people who farm it, and then take the surplus capital, invest that in the cities, invest that in the factories. That's the 5-year plan. That's Stalinist industrialization. So these ideas are the opposites of each other. One is to take a modern country and balance it with agriculture. The other is to take an agricultural country and make it more urban and modern. What do they have in common? What they have in common, above all things, is territory. From the point of view of Berlin and from the point of view of Moscow, Ukraine is the crucial place in the world. Now, this may seem like a strange thing to say. Ukraine is the crucial place in the world. Anyone who has gone there or tried to do business in Ukraine will have a sense that maybe Ukraine is not the center of all things. But think of it for a moment in terms of a natural resource. Okay, and this may be the most important thing I'm going to say in this entire lecture, and it's also the simplest. That in the 1930s, food was still a natural resource the way that oil or natural gas is for us. We can now produce lots and lots of food thanks to hybrids, pesticides, irrigation, right? Thanks to technological advances which were just beginning in the 1930s. Fertilizers I didn't mention, probably the most important. Those things have changed the entire world political economy for us. For example, they've changed the meaning of the word calorie. In the 1930s, German planners and Soviet planners were counting calories. Why? Not for the reasons we count calories. They were counting calories because they needed to make sure there were enough calories, units of energy, for the oxen, the horses, and the male human beings who were still powering the economy, right? That is the thing about this period which is most difficult for us to see. Because of things that are never mentioned in histories of the Holocaust or of mass killing, fertilizers, hybrids, and so on, our world is now completely different from that, right? And therefore, we can't really imagine how important a place like Ukraine was. But Ukraine was central for this reason. It was a breadbasket. It really was. And in the imaginations of Stalin and Hitler, it was more than a breadbasket. It was the place that would allow them to break the rules of conventional economics. It was the place that would allow their visions to be realized. It was the place that would allow National Socialism, or socialism, depending on your point of view, to actually come into existence. It was a kind of magical terrain. And remember, this is the 1930s, when everyone was looking for that magical thing which would allow us to break through capitalism. In the 1930s, capitalism had failed. Pretty much everyone agreed with that. Democracy, for that matter, as well. And the question was, how are you going to break through to the next thing which will save your country and perhaps humanity? This is the terms in which people thought. Anyway, for both of these regimes, the place in question was Ukraine. Now, this means that, if you followed me so far, what you can see is that ideology is not just a matter of ideas. Ideology leads us back to geography. Ideology for both the Nazis and the Soviets is, of course, global. It's international. There is a global view, right? The Nazis think there will be what they call a war of the continents, in which they eventually defeat the Americans and the British if necessary. The Soviets think there will eventually be a world revolution in which our revolutionary state will be joined by all of the important states of the world. There is a global vision in the long term. But in the meantime, and the meantime is the most important time because it's the only time that ever really exists. In the meantime, what they have to do is to control a certain part of Europe. For Germany, first there has to be control of Lebensraum, what Hitler calls Lebensraum, this empire in the east. For Stalin, there first has to be control of the Western Soviet Union, above all, Ukraine. So you see what this means. It means that regimes that have different ideas, different institutions, different ideas about time, and different notions of political economy can nevertheless be led back to the same place. Now, if that much is true, you can, so to speak, anticipate what's going to happen. What then happens in the book, the mass murder of 14 million people, ceases, I think, to be so surprising. If we understand that you have these two very different regimes that are nevertheless focusing their neo-colonial plans on the same part of the world, that this will be the part of the world where more people will die in this period than anywhere else, will not be so surprising. And we can be more specific than that. It won't be surprising that the people will die between Berlin and Moscow, because those are going to be the territories touched by not one, but by both of these plans. We won't be so surprised that the place where more people will die than anywhere else between 1933 and 1945 will be Ukraine, because we know that Ukraine is at the center of both of the plans of both of these regimes. We won't be surprised that Belarus, to name a place which is almost never named, is going to be the place which is most dangerous when the two regimes finally fight, because Belarus is between Berlin and Moscow. That's the invasion route. And we won't be surprised that before these two regimes fight, there will be a place where they can agree, and that's a place that I haven't mentioned thus far. The place where they can agree is obviously Poland. There's one sovereign state between Germany and the Soviet Union in the 1930s, and that sovereign state is Poland. From the point of view of each of these visions of transformation, different as they are, the thing that stands in the way, the political entity that stands in the way, is the independent Polish state. And so when the two regimes can agree, as they do in 1939, when they become allies, what they're agreeing about is that Poland has to be destroyed. Now, what does this mean for the Jews? I've mentioned just briefly what it might mean for Ukraine, for Belarus, for Poland, and that in a way is the answer to the question. Where do Jews live in the world in the 1920s and 1930s? Here. So even if you didn't know anything at all about Hitler, even if you didn't know that Hitler was an anti-Semite, even if you didn't know that Hitler's anti-Semitism was of a specific kind, where he ascribed to the Jews the blame for everything which happened to Germany, even if you didn't know that Hitler's view, his ecological view of the world, was one in which Jews had to be eliminated so a proper struggle between the races could ensue, even if you didn't understand that Hitler had a metaphysical view about the world in which Jews had to disappear, even if you didn't know those very basic things, you could look at this map, and just on the basis of what I've said, you could anticipate that the years 1933 to 1945 would be very bad for the Jews, because this is where the Jews live. The two countries which have the largest Jewish populations in Europe by far at this time are Poland and the Soviet Union. And most of the Jews in the Soviet Union live precisely in Belarus and Ukraine and Western Russia. So even if you don't know all the things which we know about Hitler, this alone tells us that things are going to be bad for the Jews. Once you understand that one of Hitler's aims is to eliminate the Jews, and that Hitler will blame Jews when things don't go his way and escalate his attacks on Jews when things don't go his way, then the Holocaust itself, I think, starts to become easier to understand. Okay, so how does the book in fact work? What I've done thus far is to try to give you a sort of general argument about why we might anticipate, why we could, and how we could understand this episode of mass killing. What I do in the book is something different. What I do in the book is I try to give you an account of each of the individual policies of mass killing as and when and how they transpired. So the first chapter deals with the famine in Soviet Ukraine, which, as we now know beyond a shadow of a doubt, based on Soviet documents, was something that Stalin anticipated and intended. The second chapters, 2 and 3, deal with the Great Terror in the Soviet Union in 1937 and 1938. We know a lot about the terror that we didn't know during the Cold War. If you remember the Cold War, I'm not expecting you to remember the French Revolution, but I am expecting some of you to remember the Cold War. If you remember the Cold War, there was a notion of Soviet terror that it fastened upon the communists, the officers. We had the image from the show trials of sympathetic people who wore glasses, who had to make false confessions and so on. This is not what the terror was really like. The terror was mainly two actions. The first was directed at kulaks. What's a kulak? A kulak in Russian is a prosperous peasant. In practice, a kulak was a politically suspect peasant. How do you become a politically suspect peasant? Well, for example, you survive famine conditions in Ukraine. You're sent to the gulag for 5 years. You survive those 5 years in the gulag, and you come back home in 1936. You're a politically suspect peasant at that point because it's possible that you don't love the regime. The major action of the terror, the kulak action of 1937, 1938, was directed precisely against that group. So around 400,000 people were shot. Now, the reason why I'm stressing this is that the peasants and workers were the major victims of Soviet terror. We tended to see people like the intellectuals in the show trials because we sympathized with them and they were literally visible. And we tend to remember the military officers, but the terror was a mass action, not only in the sense that it was big, but in the sense that it was directed against the masses of society, against the workers and the peasants. The second major action in the Great Terror is even more surprising, and this is something which every scholar of the Soviet Union now knows, but it's very difficult to get across because it's so surprising. The second major action of the Great Terror were the national actions, where the Soviets shot and exiled very large numbers of members of their own national minorities. national minorities which Stalin concluded in 1937 or 1938 might be connected to the Soviet Union's enemies abroad. So, for example, all of the Koreans in the Soviet Union, every last one, every single one was exiled on the logic that they might be spies for Japan, because Japan at that point occupied Korea. In the major killing action among the national actions, the Soviet Union had approximately 110,000 of its own citizens shot on charges of being spies for Poland. None of these people, this is a different body of work that I've done, none of these people was actually a spy. They were all selected on the basis of things like going to church in a Catholic church, celebrating Christmas on the 25th of December as opposed to in January, having rosaries, speaking Polish, things like this. In other words, in practice, the national actions against Poles, Latvians, Estonians, Finns, and others were ethnic actions. And the ethnic actions killed about 250,000 Soviet citizens. So in sum, the Great Terror, and we now know this with some precision, killed close to 800,000 people in 1937 to 1938. The vast majority of them were peasants. The second large group to think about were the national minorities. And of course, most of them were peasants too, if you want to think about it that way. Chapter 4 is a very important chapter because it's in chapter 4 that the two regimes come together. And they come together as military allies. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact is signed in August of 1939. A treaty on borders and friendship is signed in September of 1939, after Germany and the Soviet Union have already invaded and divided Poland, met in the middle, had victory marches and so on. Victory marches together, I would emphasize, and so on. Excuse me? Oh, sorry, you weren't talking to me, okay. So this is a very important moment for some reasons that are obvious and for some reasons that I want to explain. Obvious reasons have to do with national history, right? So who wants you to remember the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact? The Poles want you to remember the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Also, the Latvians and the Lithuanians and the Estonians, because as a result of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, they lost their statehood. It's thought of as a matter of national history. Soviet terror extends westward into eastern Poland, into the Baltics. That's obvious. A little bit less obvious, but just as important. This is the moment when German terror extends eastward and where German terror comes to exist, and that's a point that I would stress. Up until August of 1939, the Germans had killed a few hundred people, and there were about 20,000 people in German concentration camps. Once the Germans invade Poland, the scales change dramatically. The Germans enter Poland with units, the name of which will probably be familiar to you, with Einsatzgruppen, who were tasked to physically eliminate the Polish intelligentsia, that is, essentially shoot everyone who had a higher education so that Poland could never rise again as a state. In Poland, the Germans did things with Jews which they were not doing at home, namely round them up and put them into ghettos in the anticipation that they were going to be deported to Madagascar, was at that time the idea. But I want you to think ahead for a moment, and this is the least obvious thing, but maybe the most important. What happens in 1939 is that a seriously large number of states are destroyed. Austria is destroyed in 38, Czechoslovakia 38, 39. In 39 and 40, Poland and the Baltic states are destroyed. This, as I've said, is the kind of thing that national historians from Eastern Europe would very much like for you to remember. They would very much like for you to remember that the war starts in Poland and so on, and it does. But for whom is this most important? It is most important for the Jews. Why is that? Because statehood, the rule of law, and citizenship are always more important for national minorities than they are for national majorities. Very simple statement, it's true. So the point is not that Jews had it great in interwar Poland or in the interwar Baltic states. That's not the point at all. The point is that when those states are destroyed, things can then happen to the Jews which would have been inconceivable so long as those states existed. I'll be happy to give this to you as an explanation. It's a big part of my lecture tomorrow. But let me just give you some numbers to try to get this point across very quickly. If you were a Jew who lived in a place where the state was destroyed, your chances of surviving the Holocaust were 1 in 20. Your chances of dying, 19 in 20. If you were a Jew who lived in a place where there was a state, even if that state was Nazi Germany, even if that state was a Nazi ally, Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania, Italy, France, your chances of surviving were 1 in 2. 1 in 2 is horrible. 1 in 2 is worse than any other crime that was committed during this time, but it's rather different than 1 in 20, right? So the destruction of states, the idea that the war was not just about occupation, like previous wars had been, like even the First World War had been, but that this war was about destroying states, about destroying whole political entities. That was fateful for everyone, but it was most fateful for the Jews. Okay, end of excursus. In the 5th chapter, I write about political economy. And the reason I write about political economy is just to make sure that everyone is still paying attention. The reason I write about political economy is because we have to be able to understand what the Germans thought they were doing, what the colony was they thought they were making, because if we don't understand what they thought they were doing, it's very hard to understand what they in fact ended up doing. To make a very long story short, what the Germans thought they were doing was invading the Soviet Union in June of 1941, destroying the Red Army and therefore the Soviet state in 9 weeks, starving in the first winter after the war 30 million Soviet citizens, and then beginning a long-term colonization plan in which further millions of Soviet citizens would be enslaved, deported, or starved to death. That's what they thought they were doing. What they did, in fact, was invade the Soviet Union, meet with a great deal of resistance, much more than they expected, found themselves forced to scale back their starvation policies. They still starved on a horrendous scale, around 3 million Soviet prisoners of war. That's the second great German crime after the Holocaust. About 1 million people in besieged Leningrad, tens of thousands of people in Kiev and Kharkiv. But they had to scale back their starvation plans because you can't carry out an occupation policy and starve everyone to death if a war is still going on. And colonization, they could only barely start with. There are a couple of examples where they start their colonization, like around Zamość in Poland. But in general, they can't colonize. But the thing that they change, or the way they react to failure, is they accelerate what they call the final solution. Up until this point, policies towards the Jews had, from 33 to 38, they'd been about immigration under coercive and humiliating and impoverishing circumstances, but immigration. After the invasion of Poland, the idea about the Jews was that they were going to be deported somewhere very far away. The main idea was Madagascar. I'll talk about that if you're interested. It's the kind of thing which seems funny when you say it, but it gives you a sense of how the Germans really thought about the world. Then, when that proved to be impossible, because the British stayed in the war, and the Germans were actually counting on the British merchant marine to help them ship the Jews to Madagascar, by the way. The British stay in the war, this is impossible. The next idea, as of the summer of 1941, is that all the Jews are going to be deported to Siberia, and in Heydrich's version, they're going to be put in the Gulag. So this is not possible because the Soviet Union isn't destroyed. What the Germans find out as they invade the Soviet Union is that there is a final solution that's practicable. And that final solution that is practicable is not deportation, it's killing Jews where they live. So with the help of local collaborators, which was indispensable, both for the beginning and the continuation of this policy, the Germans kill about 1 million Jews by shooting by the end of 1941. And the shooting of Jews continues throughout the war. Roughly half the Jews who were killed in the Holocaust are shot. But the crucial thing here is that the Germans have arrived at the version of the final solution which is actually, from their point of view, effective. Creating the gas chambers at Belzec and Chelmno, Sobibor, Treblinka, later Auschwitz, is a technical improvement from their point of view because it means that fewer people have to be involved and the stress is less for the German soldiers and so on, the German policemen. But it's a continuation of a policy which is arrived at in late 1941 in the Soviet Union. In the rest of the book, I try to make sure we understand the course of the Holocaust as it proceeds from the Baltic states to Ukraine to Belarus and finally back to Poland. And I close with a couple of chapters about the occupation of Warsaw and then about ethnic cleansing and Stalinist anti-Semitism after the war. What I'd like to do now as I close is just give you a couple of thoughts, a couple of things to think about. The first is that I want to try to make clear what this book is about and what it's not about. This is not really a comparison, as I hope is clear by now. In order to compare two things, you first take them apart, you separate them, and then you say, this has this quality, this has the other quality. So for example, I'm standing and you're sitting, I'm talking and you're quiet, and so on. After I'm done, that's a comparison. After I'm done, and you start asking me questions, then we'll have an interaction, right? Then the dividing line between us breaks down. My book is much more about interaction than it's about comparison. And there's a very simple reason for this. You can't compare two things unless you have already understood them both as well as they can be understood. And from my point of view, we haven't understood these two things, these two regimes, until we've understood their killing policies. And we haven't understood their killing policies until we've looked carefully at the territory. So this is much more a book about interaction. Sometimes they interact, and sometimes they don't. And that's an empirical question. It's a question to be answered on the basis of documents, on the basis of facts. They interact importantly in 1939 when they're military allies. They interact in a different way after 1941 when they're enemies and sometimes provoke each other to do certain things. But they're not always interacting. Sometimes their policies are completely separate. It's a boring empirical question. That said, I want to say something about comparisons, because although my aim and even my interests are not really comparative, I think it's important to see that comparison is an inherent part of history. And if we don't compare, we're not in a position to write, understand history, or to think historically in any way. If there were taboos on comparing things like the Nazis and the Soviets, it would be very difficult for us to think at all. Right? Like, for example, just to take an accidental example, I mentioned that in 1939, there were about 20,000 people in German concentration camps. In 1939, in Soviet concentration camps, there were well over 1 million people. Okay, we've all just made a comparison, right? How would we stop ourselves from doing that and still think? It's not possible. The comparisons are a natural part of the way one thinks about history. Likewise, and in some sense, we're not so important here. Likewise, let's think about the experience of the locals. If you read Holocaust testimonies, or for that matter, any first-person accounts from the period, you notice that the people who lived here compared all the time, for the very simple reason that they weren't thinking, oh, 70 years from now there's going to be some kind of taboo and I have to watch what I say, right? That's ridiculous. That's grotesque. The reason why they compare is they're trying to survive. They're under one regime. They know another one is coming. They're thinking about what to do. So a Jew in Warsaw in 1939, when the Red Army is coming from one side and the Wehrmacht is coming from another, thinks about what to do. In order to think about what to do, you have to make a comparison. A starving Ukrainian in 1933 who manages to live through that and ends up in a German starvation camp in 1941 compares the two of them, right? How would he not compare the two of them? It would be very strange not to. This is the experience of everyone who lives here for as long as they live. And anyone who pays any attention to the primary sources knows that comparison is something not which we impose on the sources, but which we take out of the sources. We extract them from the sources, but the comparisons are there. The final thing which is important to say about this is that unless we compare, we're not in a position to be sure about our conclusions. I'll just give you one example about this. I mentioned this to some of the students ahead of time, so please forgive me for repeating myself. But up until I wrote this book, the standard way that historians of the Holocaust compared these two regimes was to say, well, the Soviets killed more people, but the Holocaust was nevertheless worse because it was the only attempt to target racially an entire population, which is true. The second part is true. What's not true is the first part. The Holocaust alone actually killed more people than all of Stalin's terror put together. The only way you can know that, though, is to compare, right? So if you put everything together into one book, you end up seeing just how extraordinarily different the Holocaust was. And you can do so in a way without having to insist, because you know what all the other policies were. Okay, I've given you a couple of things to think about interaction and comparison, but this, as I want to stress, is not really what the book is about. Or it's only one of the things that the book is about. In any good history book, we try to do two things. We try to describe and we try to explain. There's explanation and then there's significance. I've spent most of this lecture talking about explanation, how an event of this kind, how the mass murder of 14 million people could have happened. But the other side of history, and the other side of the book, and the side which I can't really get across so well in a lecture, is significance. Why should we care? Why does this matter? And this is less straightforward than it might seem. The reason why it's less straightforward than it might seem is that big numbers are very difficult for us. Hitler and Stalin left us with very big numbers, whether it's the 14 million that I'm giving you, or 6 million, or 3 million. I would even say a number like 20,000. These numbers are too big for us to process. They are part of the intellectual inheritance we have from Hitler and Stalin, from the Nazis and the Soviets. It's not an intellectual inheritance we can very easily deal with. So one of the things that I think it's important for us to try to do as historians and as humanists is to think about numbers not as a kind of block, but to think about them as a group of individuals. Again, harder than it sounds. So what is 14 million? 14 million is not 14 million. 14 million is 14 million times 1, where each one is not some generic unit, but each one is different than the one who came before or the one who came after. Each Jew at Babi Yar is different than the Jew who came before or came after. Each Ukrainian who starves in a village outside of Kiev is different than the one who starves before and the one who comes after. Each Pole who's shot in the Polish action in 1937 is a different human being than the next Pole. In other words, we have to be in a position to see that large numbers are made up of small numbers, and that a small number is not just a number, a small number is individuality, a small number is a life. That the difference between 0 and 1 is not the difference between 0 and 1. That the difference between 0 and 1 is a kind of infinity. And that infinity is also what we're writing about. So, in that spirit, having spent the last hour talking to you about method and causes and interactions and such things, I want to leave you with the names of the people with whom I began. Because of course there aren't just 14 million histories here, there are 14 million names. So the Ukrainian who starved to death, but who dug his own grave, his name was Petro Veldi. The Polish officer who kept a diary in 1940, his name was Adam Solski, and the young Jewish woman who died in Kovel with her 2 sisters. Her mother was also killed. Her name was Dobcha Kagan. Thank you very much.
Please ask questions of Professor Snyder.
But could I just ask you to please identify yourselves, and also, and this is my East European point, please pose your question in the form of a question. Thanks. I'm going to start over here. Yes, ma'am.
I apologize if I'm not being polite. I don't mean to be polite. If you're in eastern Poland and say a Soviet comes to your town, he's not going to decide to shoot all the Jews in town. He's just going to arrest the people that say are kulak and rich and not bowing to the system. And so the reason so many Jews end up in concentration camps is because that town is mostly Jewish. Is that correct? And he's not looking at it and saying, you don't have blonde hair and blue eyes. He's just, is that correct?
I'm going to reiterate the question because probably not everyone can hear it. The question, it has to do with the difference between Soviet and Nazi categorization, and the way that it's posed is if a Soviet soldier comes into a town in eastern Poland, he's not going to be shooting all of the people who were regarded racially as Jews. He's going to be dealing with people who were seen as enemies of the state. Is that a fair summary? Okay. So it's a really important question because it allows us to see what is a very significant difference in the worldview that is embodied in Nazi Germany and the worldview that's embodied in the Soviet Union. These worldviews both involve the view that history is a competition. They're both social Darwinist worldviews in which the Nazis see a competition among races and the Soviets see a competition among classes. They're both views in which see a certain end to this competition. In Hitler's view, what's going to happen is that once the Jews are removed from the system, then the other races are going to fight it out, and the Germans are most likely going to win. And if they don't win, and this is interesting about Hitler, and this is why Hitler's not actually a German nationalist, if the Germans don't win and somebody else wins, that's fine too, because the only thing that matters is the racial struggle. The only good in the world is the racial struggle, according to Hitler. Whereas for the Soviets, the end of history is that the working class or its representatives in the party will eventually take political control around the world, and this will lead to a kind of a socialist utopia, which is never quite defined. So these are very different worldviews, and in practice, they lead to different kinds of killing. The Soviets kill chiefly as they are pursuing policies and see those policies not quite work out the way they expect. So you can't look into Stalin's early writings and find some kind of cosmological hatred of Ukrainians, even though Ukrainians turn out to be the greatest victim. The reason why Stalin kills so many Ukrainians has to do with the fact that that Ukraine is seen as strategically sensitive, it's on the border with Poland, and from the fact that it's economically incredibly important. And so when his own plans don't go well in Ukraine as a republic is going to be blamed. And I would emphasize also here too, and this is in the spirit of your question, that when Stalin enforces a hunger policy on Ukraine, it's on the Soviet Republic of Ukraine. So many of the people who die as a result are Germans and Poles and Russians and Jews for that matter, which is totally forgotten. And more Jews are killed by famine in Soviet Ukraine in the 1930s by far than are killed by anything Hitler does in the 1930s. Right? By far, it's not even close. The number of Jews who were killed by Stalin in the 1930s is greater than by the number of Jews killed by Hitler in the 1930s by a factor of 100. It's about 100 to 1. But we don't see that because we think about these things. We think about these things with the two systems side by side. So they're different, and the effect is that, as you say, the Soviet system is lined up to threaten people who seem to be challenging its accomplishments, right? It's funny because it's almost a kind of conservative reaction. We have this revolution. We have to protect this revolution for the foreseeable future because for the time being there's still capitalism and imperialism. And in the meantime, we have to get rid of those enemies. Now, those enemies are often grouped according to categories, and this is important too. It's not just that the Soviets say, this guy is a threat and this woman is a threat. They do think according to categories. And the farthest this ever goes are the national actions of 37 and 38. But you're right, those people they're being thought of as ethnic categories, but that's as close as Stalin gets to Hitler. Hitler thinks of the Jews not as another nation. The Jews are a kind of cosmological or I think ecological threat. Their existence is going to destroy the world from Hitler's point of view. And so Hitler has something in the back of his mind which is not comparable to something that Stalin has, and that is the notion that at the end of the war, I'm just going to eliminate this entire population. Now, so there's a difference in ideas, but there are two, and the difference leads to different outcomes. But there's always a certain amount of overlap, and even if one only cares about Jewish history, one has to look at what the Soviets do. So when the Soviets deport in 1940, which I think is what you're talking about, the second largest group of deportees are Jews. Jews are sent to Kazakhstan for the most part. About 15% of them die, which is a very large number. The reason that they are sent is not because they're Jewish. The reason that they are sent is because, and this helps us see just how complicated this history was. These are people who fled German occupation. Okay? They made the kind of decision I was talking about. They fled to the east. They found themselves under Soviet occupation. Then the Soviets start asking people, preparatory to giving them Soviet citizenship, what are your plans for after the war? Do you want to stay here in the glorious Soviet homeland, or do you plan to return to your homes? Naturally, almost all of the Jews said, we plan to return to our homes. They plan to go back to Łódź or Warsaw, or wherever they came from, right? If you gave that answer on that questionnaire, you went to Kazakhstan. And that's why 85,000 Jews were sent to Kazakhstan, where most of them are going to survive. So as you say, it's political, right? Although it also has something to do with a particularly Jewish experience, which is the flight from the German regime. There are many more things that I could say about this. I've probably gone on too long already, though, and so I should let the next gentleman ask a question. Thanks. Yes, sir.
My public qualification researcher at the University of Texas institution. You mentioned Madagascar, and that's not. What is Madagascar? Do you have any idea for the Jewish population? What are the different discovered there, but you never know.
So thank you for that question, because it helps us to see something which we ordinarily don't see, which is that Hitler, in a warped way, in a strange way, but nevertheless in an unmissable way, thought globally. Hitler was thinking about Germany's destiny in global categories. What Germany is supposed to become is a global power, a great power which can compete with Britain, which is the other superpower, the only superpower really, and the United States, whom Hitler correctly identifies as the coming superpower in the world. How can you do this? Well, I'm going to get around to Madagascar, don't worry, but this is important. The only way to do this is to become a frontier empire. Because the rest, you can't be a maritime empire because for all intents and purposes you have no navy. You can't challenge the British on the sea lanes. So you have to become a frontier empire. And being a frontier, and by the way, the comparison for Hitler was the United States, just food for thought. The United States was Hitler's model. So the way to become a frontier empire is to move this way, right? So that's the Volga River. Hitler says the Volga will be our Mississippi, right? And he means it more or less literally. We're going to create a land frontier empire which will allow us to become a great power. What do you do with the Jews along the way? What do you do with the people you try to eliminate? Well, here you face the same problem again. Germany, in order to become an empire, can't go out into the seas. It has to stay on land. But you want to get the Jews away. You want to get them very far away, and there doesn't seem to be any place in the world that can or will take them, right? So Madagascar is one of the ideas, like Belize and Uganda and Palestine, that various people are talking about from the late 19th century through the 1920s and 30s. And when I say various people, I mean there's a Zionist version. In all of these places, there's always a Zionist version, and then there's an anti-Semitic version, right? And sometimes it's hard to know exactly where one stops and the other starts. But Madagascar was talked about first by French anti-Semites in the late 1890s. It then had a career in England. It was picked up by the Volkische Beobachter, by the Nazi daily, in, if I'm remembering right, the early 1930s. And it had its most significant career in Poland, where the Polish government both wanted to become an imperial power and wanted to get rid of many of its Jews in the late 1930s. And their idea for doing this was to talk with France about Madagascar. Madagascar, as I should have already said, was a French possession. So the Polish government goes to Léon Blum, who by the way is Jewish, the French prime minister, and ask him if they might perhaps get Madagascar as a new homeland for the Jews. And Blum says, you know, go and have a look. So the Poles send an expedition with some Poles and some Jews of Polish citizenship, who basically report back that this does not make a whole lot of sense. Especially the Jewish delegate who went along made quite clear that Madagascar was not going to be a solution to, you know, what people in Poland call the Jewish problem. And that's as far as it went. But this notion that you could put the Jews in Madagascar was so widely spread that when the Germans start to have a large scale, what they think of also as a Jewish problem, they immediately start to think about Madagascar. So in 37, 38, when the Germans think that they are going to be going to war against the Soviet Union with Poland as an ally, or Poland as a friendly neutral, they think that they and the Poles are going to together send all of these East European Jews to Madagascar. Because remember, there aren't that many, I should have stressed this, there aren't that many Jews in Germany, right? The 97% of the victims of the Holocaust are non-German Jews. The Jews are east of Germany, and Germany's imperial plans take it east. So there's going to be a much bigger, from their point of view, Jewish problem once they go east. When they think about allying with Poland, and then later once they ally with the Soviet Union, destroy Poland, they think Madagascar. And when they go into France in early 1940, one of the first things they do is that they look in the French archives for the French Franco-Polish discussions about Madagascar, because they think this is a live idea. Where it fails also tells us something about imperial power. How does it fail? Well, Germany has knocked over France in the spring of 1940, so Madagascar, you think they could do what they want with it, but they can't, because Germany is not a maritime power. And despite the fall of France, and this is the crucial thing, Great Britain stays in the war. You know, Hitler thought if he could knock down France, the British would leave, which had a certain rationale to it. What interest did the British have in the continent? How was Hitler disturbing them? Many members of the British Parliament, of course, thought this as well, and many Americans thought this as well. It seemed as though the war in Europe at that point should be over. But Churchill crucially did not think this way. And so for that very important moment from the summer of 1940 until the end of 1941, when we finally get into the war, and the Soviets get into the war in the mid-1940s, so for a whole year, the British are basically on their own against the Nazis. I mean, this is a kind of heroic moment, which we often forget. During that time, the fact that Britain stays in the war means that there is a war for us to join later, but it also means that something like Madagascar is completely impossible because the British control the sea lanes. But that's a detailed way of saying that it forces the Germans back into thinking about getting rid of the Jews someplace close to where they are. So their next thought after that is, okay, we're going to invade the Soviet Union, and when we invade the Soviet Union, that will knock the British out of the war. Then they'll see how hopeless it is, and that'll allow us to push the Jews east into Siberia. And then it's when that failed, as I've already discussed, that they realized that what they can do is something much worse, of course, which is kill the Jews where they live.
Okay. One more question.
Okay. Sorry, which one did you call?
Martha Sachs. I was wondering how it is you talk about history formally as national history, and you talk about your own book as transcending, and you seem to say that in your own work you're really setting a paradigm. So I wonder how that came about.
Well, it came about through a series of my own failures, of course. I mean, the only way that you see the things that have to be done is to fail at them yourself. So, I mean, I'm not saying that I'm the only one who has made the discovery that national history has certain limitations. I'll try to give you a short answer because you're asking about me, and I don't think I'm that interesting. But what I discovered was, as I was writing about various kinds of national conflicts, ethnic cleansing, the Holocaust, the first thing that I tried to do was to say, okay, there's Polish national history, there's Ukrainian national history. I'm going to understand both of those things because clearly I'm just giving this as an example, but within Polish national history, there aren't the answers. You know, there's a lot of information, there are wonderful books, there are amazing colleagues, but there are certain limitations which are defined by use of language, the way that questions are asked, the fact that certain phenomena, like the Holocaust is a crucial example, just go beyond borders, and there's no way you can catch them if you stay within a country, even important a country as Poland is. So I said, okay, what I'll do then is I'll add more national history, like I'll learn Ukrainian, right? I'll learn Yiddish. I'll add other national histories to this, and that will give me the comparison, that'll give me the other perspective, that'll allow me to go back and forth. And with that, I wrote a book called The Reconstruction of Nations, which I don't think is a bad book. I think many people think it's my best book, but it's a book in which I look at the national paradigms and I try to show how they emerged historically and how they emerged from something else. But the problem with that book was that at the end, I'm talking about various kinds of national catastrophes. And some of them, and the Holocaust is the most important, some of them went beyond what I could do with comparative national history. They required some other sort of framework. They required a framework which would allow me to get past not just the European nations territorially, but to get past them conceptually. And that's how I got to the territory itself. There are many other people who have done similar things. You know, I'm not claiming this is some kind of tremendous intellectual breakthrough. I think if anything, at least I hope anyway, once one makes the point that if you're going to study the Holocaust, it's legitimate, and perhaps you even have to look at the territory where it happened, right? I like to think that once you make that kind of really simple point, it seems sort of self-evident. I'm hoping people will agree. But I don't want to say that this is some kind of fantastic intellectual transcendence. I actually like to think that what's happening is that this kind of history is actually intellectually simpler and more elegant in a certain way than the national history might be. But in any event, it legitimates itself by giving us new kinds of findings and new kinds of arguments and allowing us to see things we might not see otherwise.